Hey guys, this is Matthew with Disarm Harm. This is video lesson number 2 on scientific research in psychology. The topic today is going to be a model of scientific research in psychology. All right, let's get our hands dirty here by talking about the research cycle. So usually what ends up happening inside of the research cycle is we have informal observations or practical problems that we need to resolve. Whether that happens within our own lives or that happens happens from our government, or we get commissioned from our teachers, or whatever the case may be. We end up forming what's called a research question, where we might ask ourselves, hey, why are bananas yellow? So what we do is we have a tendency to go to the research literature and we type into Google, why are bananas yellow? And we end up finding out why the bananas are yellow. So some of us never really got out of that phase of childhood where we stopped asking why. 4-year-olds, how they're like, why? Don't discourage that. Don't get your kid to stop doing that. We end up getting into the mess that we're in now. But we end up forming this research question. We go, okay, why is a banana yellow? Well, the banana is yellow because of phytochemicals inside of the banana. Okay, well, what are phytochemicals? We form another research question. So we end up going in and we realize that phytochemicals are these, I'm speaking on my ass, I'll be honest, these enzyme compounds that are within food that oftentimes give bananas their color, and they act as coenzymes with our hormones that end up performing functions inside of our body. Okay, well, what are hormones? Well, hormones are, and it just goes on and on and on and on and on. The thing is that oftentimes when we're looking at scientific discovery and research, we ask the question why, about 10,000 times before we come to this interesting conclusion. What happens is we do a literature review. So an example of this might be what I'm doing, for example, where I asked myself the question a number of months ago, should we be allowing life coaches to use psychedelic integration services in the Canadian mental health market? And I noticed that there was an article on CBC about the explosion of psychedelic integration services amongst life coaches and people who were coaching people in the field of psychology with no actual formal training whatsoever, and whether or not they were qualified to do that. I asked if that was even ethical. Something just kind of felt off about it, you know what I mean? A couple organizations around me that were doing it and still are doing it even to this day. And I began to ask the question, okay, well, is that even ethical? Should that be something that's in the Canadian mental health market? Which then turned into, well, how do we define coaches? So I started Googling, well, how do we define coaches, and using Google Scholar for defining coaches. And then I asked, well, how do coaches define themselves? And that turned into, well, do coaches have regulations on what they should and should not be doing? And that turned into, well, what are the regulations on coaching? And that turned into, does the Canadian public know the difference between a coach, a psychologist, a psychotherapist, and a counselor and a social worker? Now, what happened here was that I ended up forming this question and getting further and further and further down the line, answering my questions as I went along through this research literature. I kept going and going and going and going and going, and eventually I found what we call a gap in the research. And does the Canadian public know the difference between a coach, psychologist, psychotherapist, a counselor, and a social worker? And my educated guess, or my hypothesis, is that no, they do not. But I decided, hey, that's important for us to research. So what that I then did is I was like, okay, well, let's set up a questionnaire and a survey study to find out if that's actually true or not. So then you set up a survey study, and using statistics and life sciences, we end up going and creating our data analysis. And in our data analysis, we form our inferential or our conclusions. And then we go back, into our research literature. Because what oftentimes happens is when we ask these questions, we then have to ask, well, is this method the most accurate method to be doing this? And then the wheel keeps turning, right? Forms another research question. What's a better method to determine whether or not people know the difference between a coach, psychologist, psychotherapist, a counselor, and a social worker? Well, then we go back to do another empirical study, and you see how the research cycle ultimately ends up working. So a model of scientific research in psychology is a researcher. And basically what a researcher is somebody who formulates a research question, conducts a study designed to answer the question, analyzes the resulting data, draws conclusions about the answer to the question, and then publishes the results as a part of the research literature. So, new research, new questions. Oftentimes, like I said, new research leads to new questions, which leads to new research, and so on. New research can actually exist outside of the research cycle with either informal observations or with practical problems that need to be solved. And like I said, there's an informal observation where I just saw in society, I was like, well, we've got these psychedelic coaches. Is that ethical? That was an informal observation. And then we have practical problems, which the practical problem that's formed from that is, well, what is the impact on the Canadian mental health care system? So basically, once I've determined whether the Canadian public knows the difference between a coach, a psychologist, a social worker, and a counselor, the question then becomes is, what is the impact this lack of education is having on Canadian mental health, which allows me to further the research along. There is a model of scientific research in psychology. Like I said, the study of chatty women. This was done by Matthias Meal. What they discovered was that, the study of chatty women was like, well, psychology had this bias, this prejudice in thinking that was stating that women spoke on average twice as much as men do in a day. Now, I know from personal experience that that's not true because I like to talk a lot. But they had discovered that despite the bias and the prejudice, it was actually found that no such research had existed. Nobody had actually answered the question. They found the result and they published the literature. Research, however, doesn't actually stop there. And we went over this study in a previous course where it wasn't statistically relevant. But then more questions, like I said, can be added to this research, such as what is the reliability of the results? What about potential cultural differences? Was the population big enough? Was the sample big enough? Was the method the best method for collecting the data? So on and so on and so on. Other researchers will actually take up the mantle of this work and ask these questions to determine the validity of the research. For me, taking up the mantle of work is in regards to science versus pseudoscience versus how that impacts society, how we can structure mental health in a better way. My research is specifically that was founded and recently passed on by Scott Lilienfield out of the University of Arizona. My research literature ended up leading me down that rabbit hole of what he was producing. And then I started reading the studies surrounding the studies on that. And it was just really fascinating for me to discover this process. And this is just one of those ways that, for me, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to take up the mantle to go and do this. I presented it to a research ethics board. The research ethics board said, hey, we think that's a great idea. Nobody's really doing it. There's like 3 or 4 psychologists in all of everywhere that actually do this. And why not? Go for it. So here I am. So an example, another study was that cell phones were widespread during the 1990s and people began to wonder what effect, if any, the cell phone itself had on driving. Psychology actually decided to tackle this question. It was found after a few years of study that people's reaction time was actually significantly impaired by cell phone use. That was handled by Colette, Guillot, and Petit in 2010. You can go ahead and go to this URL and watch this video, but that is the actual study on the cell phone system or the cell phone research and its impacts on driving. And it was found that it was actually harmful. And they're continuing to do this study in terms of hand-free technology, voice-activated technology, screen technology, those kinds of things. I'm looking at you, Tesla drivers. They're studying it. They want to know. This is a system of applied research where it was like, well, we've got a problem. We need to know whether or not it's actually true. And then once we find out the study is what it is, it ends up becoming oftentimes legislation. And it did. It was like 49 states ended up banning cell phones, and all of Canada now as a federal legislation doesn't practice this. So again, what conducts scientific research in psychology? What conducts scientific research in psychology? Research in psychology is actually generally conducted by people with doctoral degrees. Usually in psychology, it's somebody with a doctor in philosophy, a PhD in philosophy. What they will have is an MPhil or a DPhil, Master of Philosophy, Doctor of Philosophy in one of the many fields, clinical psychology, forensic psychology, social psychology, counseling of psychology, these kinds of things. And further research actually includes master's students applying and creating dissertations on our studies is a form of research for universities. This is why we write undergrad theses and master's dissertations and PhD dissertations, because we want to see how far along we're going with our studies. Support roles often include research assistants with bachelor's degrees or other relevant training. Congratulations, this is the course for other relevant training. The majority of researchers are actually college or university faculty. Now you know what the hell universities are actually for. It's to teach students not just how to get into careers or jobs, but to actually generate research for the benefit of society. I know it's crazy. Many are trained, licensed and registered clinicians, and many are not. So specifically clinical psychologists are trained, licensed, registered clinicians. They end up following under the College of Psychologists here in Alberta and in Canada, for example. And they end up getting licensed so that they can go into the field not only study these individuals and effectively turn them into experiments, but also see if they can treat people in the field as well. Many aren't. Social psychologists, behavioral neuroscience, cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, personality psychology, social psychologists. The field of social psychology is what I'm interested in. Does not require any kind of governing oversight body, because a lot of the times we're not actually doing studies directly on humans unless social psychology is studying personality. So for me, I want to study obsessive compulsive personality disorder. There's not a lot of research literature on it, but it is a field I will actually have to be licensed in. And then there are, of course, criticisms of the College of Psychologists. How do you improve that system? The mental health care system. How do we improve that system? It's abysmal. The spending on mental health. How do we improve that system? All wonderful questions to ask as you go along in your research. Most people who conduct research enjoy the technical and intellectual challenge of contributing to scientific knowledge offers. Ask your university or college if you can get involved in ongoing research as either an assistant or a participant in a research project. Oftentimes, I've seen in research projects that professors will experiment on their students and give their students participation grades in order to further the professor's research. A fun and easy way to actually follow current scientific research in psychology is to read the following blogs. Psychology Today is not one of them. It is often publishing what is popular in pop psychology and does not give a shit whether or not it helps you. No offense, Psychology Today, but you suck. No offense, you suck. We got Brain Blogger, Mind Hacks, Research Digest, Talk Psych, Psyblog, Social Psychology Eye, and We're Only Humans. So if you want a bunch of current scientific research in psychology blogs, I would suggest those. Keep in mind that most of the phenomena theories that fill psychology's textbooks are the product of scientific research. They do not include the pop psychology crap that you see in the market. If they don't make it in the textbooks, oftentimes they do not make it in the minds of students. Is that good? Is that bad? That's a question that remains to be answered. Intro to psychology textbooks often include, cortical area functioning for the processing of speech and language, perception, principles of classic and operant conditioning under B.F. Skinner and Thorndike and scientists like Rogers, who, social learning theory, and, who else? Well, there's a lot of psychologists in there. Extreme behaviorism. That was, Pavlov for classic and operant conditioning, with Skinner for extreme behaviorism. There we go. Memory. Studying biases and reasoning and judgment, teaching us how to be critical thinkers. People's surprising tendency to obey those in positions of authority. That was a social experiment done by Ash. Ash's study of the little lines and, how we tend to conform to the group around us because we want to be liked more than we want to point out that the rest of the group is probably wrong. And then Milgram's study on obedience after the Holocaust and his survival and his story after the Holocaust, and figuring out how the hell decent people could just end up massacring millions of Jews. Well, his surprisings were absolutely astounding. What we do know actually only scratches the surface of what we can know. Scientific research is often classified as basic or applied. There's basic research, which is achieved for understanding a more detailed image of human behavior without necessarily trying to resolve a practical problem. The research of meal falls under this category with the Chatty Women study. Applied research, there's conducted to address a practical problem, which is the growth of unregulated coaching in the field of psychology. Or we could go a little further and say that the cell phone study was one of them. It's not always that easy. Research on how couples talk, or how women and men talk, or how often men and women talk, could actually have a huge impact on marriage therapy and how it's practiced. And then there's research on cell phones while driving, which could have a major impact on perception, attention, action, and this is why the field of psychology ends up becoming so pertinent. Hey, real quick, if you made it this far, please hit the like or subscribe button. Comment below if you can. Hit the notification bell every time you get one of these programs delivered to you, especially one of these courses. I would appreciate it greatly. You don't have to, but I would appreciate it greatly. So what conducts scientific research in psychology? Again, this is an important video. It was a TED Talk. Watch this video. Not all scientific studies are actually created equal, and you have to pay attention to that, right? There are a variety of things in quote-unquote research in comparison to an unqualified high school graduate who's offering psychology and clinical counseling services with the integration of psychedelic mushrooms into their practice versus, a PhD. Where does that fall in terms of quality of research? That's what this video is going to go over. I'm looking forward to it. Take the test below, you guys. It's on the disarmharm.com page, and I would love to see you in the next video. Talk to you soon. Bye.